And this hysteria is fueling the push that Zelensky, it's fueling Zelensky's lobbying push right now for Storm Shadow missiles to strike inside Moscow, which London absolutely supports, and the neocon wing of the foreign policy establishment in DC, which encompasses large parts of the Democratic Party now, also supports. So, tell us about that, Aaron. What are they asking for?
So it's interesting. So Zelensky is asking Biden to sign off on long-range strikes with Western weapons into Russia. And it's just so interesting. The whole episode reveals just how in the name of like combating Russia's alleged effort to like take over Ukraine and then all of Europe, right, to stop like Russian dominance, everyone's showing just how much they've subordinated themselves to Washington. Because what's happening now, they're all going to Washington to beg Biden for permission to use weapons to strike deep into Russia, which underscores how Washington controls everything here. Like even Keir Starmer is asking Joe Biden for permission. You think if Keir Starmer really believes so much in using these weapons, his own Storm Shadows, he'd just say to Zelensky, do it yourself. But they all need Daddy Biden's blessing because it's the Godfather. And when you're in a mafia racket, you have to go to the Godfather, the Mafia Don, the head Mafia Don for permission. So that's what's happening. Biden pulled back, though, or at least he's not given the permission yet. And that was interesting because the way this was being reported in the days leading up to it was that it was only a matter of time that Biden would sign off on it. And the New York Times said that Biden was going to sign off on it only so long as they use British missiles, not U.S. missiles. So that's like the classic thing where like the U.S. approves the escalation, but then puts up like someone else to bear the brunt of the consequences. So Russia doesn't retaliate against the U.S. I guess they would retaliate against Britain. I guess that was Biden's thinking. And Antony Blinken said, basically, he suggested strongly that Biden was going to improve this because Blinken said, we always adapt and adjust. We never rule anything out. And we always adapt and adjust based on the battlefield circumstances. And that's the exact same kind of phrasing that he used in previous cases where the Biden administration had approved escalatory steps that it had previously ruled out. So it seemed to be a formality. But then what happened was Putin made a very mild-mannered but direct warning that if this happens, then NATO will be at direct war with Russia and Russia will be forced to respond. And all of a sudden, you got word that some people in the Pentagon and intelligence officials didn't like that and were relaying warnings to Biden. And next thing we know, Biden backed down. And Biden was clearly agitated for some reason at his meeting with Keir Starmer on Friday, because one reporter asked Biden, like, what do you think about Vladimir Putin's warning that if you approve of these long-range strikes, that will put NATO at war with Russia? And Biden snapped back. He said, I don't think much about Vladimir Putin, which is so fun. On top of like his visible annoyance, just the idea that Joe Biden doesn't think about Vladimir Putin is so funny because the guy's obsessed with Putin. He's the guy who, when he was vice president, went to Moscow and felt entitled to tell Russian opposition leaders that Vladimir Putin shouldn't run again for president. Imagine Putin coming to the U.S. and saying that to like Republicans, that Joe Biden shouldn't run against for president, although that would have been good advice for the Democrats, So, and then of course, what does Joe Biden do in the early weeks of Russia's invasion? Like 1 month into it, he goes to Warsaw, Poland. He gives a speech supposed to be his triumphant moment, and he's so obsessed with Putin that he can't help but blurt out that for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power, admitting that his whole goal in Ukraine was to use Ukraine to bleed Russia and force regime change in Moscow. So this guy's obsessed with Putin to the point where recently, during like those brief moments, like that week or two when he was trying to make his case for staying on as the nominee against the Democratic Party revolt, what did he say to like show his credentials and his competency, his case for staying on as president? He kept saying, Putin, I'm the guy who took on Putin. So this guy's obsessed with Putin. So he was clearly agitated on Friday. I think that's because the Pentagon forced him to climb down from doing something reckless that I guess the Pentagon this time was not ready to sign off on. So we'll see what happens. Like maybe ultimately Biden will approve of this. Like they talked about maybe revisiting in a couple of weeks at the UN General Assembly. But it looks like right now, at least, Antony Blinken has lost out. And the people who actually would be responsible for the consequences of Blinken's escalatory policies, the Pentagon, have won out for now. That's my read on what happened.
Here's Putin's warning, just for posterity. United States, European countries are at war with Russia. I should probably find a better clip. Basically, what Putin is saying which I read in the New York Times, so I guess they're echoing Kremlin propaganda, is that Storm Shadow missile requires US and UK satellite assistance. It basically requires the NSA and geospatial location assistance to guide it to its target. What would its targets be? Well, we have Jake Auschenschloss, who is a ultra-liberal senator from congressman from Deep Blue, Massachusetts. Feel free to pull up the clip. He was obviously briefed. He sits in Joseph P. Kennedy III's district and is said to be a distant cousin of the Kennedys, calls for using storm shadows to strike oil storage facilities in Moscow, which would cause gigantic fires. And he wants to actually have Moscow, something we didn't even see during the Cold War, see Moscow in flames to wage an energy war on Russia. Then what Blinken's people seem to have been proposing, that they were, leaking out to the New York Times and other papers, were airstrikes or strikes by ostensibly by Ukrainians. There would be like a Ukrainian guy like Igor would be pushing the button. They would be on airfields and military targets inside Russia, and not civilian facilities like oil storage and factories and so on. But either way, we'll get to this in a second. Here's the point. This is the key takeaway. Either way, if this goes forward, there's no denying that this is a U.S. war on Russia, that the U.S. is guiding these missiles, that the U.S. is selecting and green-lighting these targets, and Putin must respond. He must respond, or he will lose all deterrence, because the whole basis of the lobbying campaign is that Putin hasn't escalated thus far. He hasn't hit NATO targets, and we've been able to get away with everything we've been doing, and all we have lost is tens of thousands of Slavic men whose lives don't matter. We don't care about Ukrainian lives. We only care about our lives in our cities. So as long as Putin doesn't respond, they're going to keep escalating. And I think the Pentagon basically told Biden and the NSC, this is what Putin can do. This is how he can harm our troops, and we don't want this. And I can offer my own theories, but yeah, play that clip now.
Well, and one more point that oh God, I was gonna add to what you were saying, but now I forgot. I forgot. Okay, I'll play the clip, and hopefully it'll come back to me.
This is the Democratic Party in a nutshell in this clip. I mean, this is how far gone they are. And this is a guy who sits in a Kennedy-held seat.
So what's your view? Is it time for the U.S. to lift these restrictions on Ukraine?
It's past time. Ukraine is undergoing a bombardment to its civilians, to its infrastructure, to its troops, and the United States is handcuffing its ability to fight back. If the American military had these restrictions in place in World War II, we wouldn't have won the war. The president must off Ukraine to strike sites of military application within Russia, and in particular, Jim, oil refining. There are 4 oil refineries around Moscow, west of the Ural Mountains, well within range of ATACMS and F-16s, that account for 20% to a third of all Russian oil refining capacity. They could be disabled with aerial bombardment, and that would significantly undermine the Russian war economy. You pair that with the adoption of tougher sanctions that the Treasury Department has been proposing to the White House, and you could deliver a 1-2 punch to Putin's petro state.
Yeah, a 1-2 punch. They would finally make the ruble rubble, and there would be no consequences.
The point I wanted to make is this. So, you were talking about the argument that is made, which we hear a lot now for making these strikes, that look, Putin hasn't retaliated. He hasn't struck back. He's soft. So therefore, we can't keep respecting these mythical Russian red lines, given that Putin never enforces them. So we can strike deep into Russia with no consequences, right? That is the argument being made. But what else is the argument being made? Putin is so reckless that if we don't stop him in Ukraine, he's going to go on to the rest of Europe, right? So on the one hand, Putin is so soft that even when he's being even when his red lines are being crossed, he's not striking back forcefully.
Right.
He's so soft that we can keep going and authorize these long-range strikes. But also, if we don't do that, he's going to go on to the rest of Europe. It makes no sense whatsoever. He's both like the softest leader ever and also the most dangerous. Like, those two ideas are both argued by the same people, depending on what day it is they want to escalate.
Yeah, Russia's a gas station with a country attached that will simultaneously overrun Europe unless we wage a military blitzkrieg against them. That's been the line. On the 18th of this month, I'm going to be giving the JFK American University kind of memorial lecture. It's a group of JFK aficionados who honor JFK's speech that he delivered, one of his final speeches before being assassinated at American University, where he urged Americans to put themselves in the shoes of the leadership and the people of the Soviet Union and to consider the danger of deepening the Cold War, which also at that point included sending more U.S. advisors to Vietnam. It was a warning that no president had delivered by that point. I mean, the warning that Eisenhower gave at the end of his administration, he died soon after, was sort of, about the military-industrial complex, was sort of a punt because he didn't leave himself with the responsibility of taking on the military-industrial complex. It was left to Kennedy, and Kennedy was gone soon after that. Now you see the acolytes of the Kennedy family, the people that representative in a district long held by the Kennedy family or controlled by the Kennedy family. Someone named after Joseph P. Kennedy, who stole the election for Jack Kennedy back in 1960 using his mafia ties, who, was a power broker in the United States. They have urinated on the legacy of John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, when they took on the Joint Chiefs, Curtis LeMay, Bombs Away LeMay, and other fanatics when they wanted to bomb Cuba over the Cuban Missile Crisis and engaged in secret diplomacy with the Soviet Union. There is no force for diplomacy within the Democratic Party. The only debate is how much should they escalate. And that's what's so dangerous here, because Donald Trump can also not, we've been talking about the way Trump is perceived by proxy warriors, but I think we agree, Aaron, Donald Trump cannot be trusted on any pledge he makes to end the Ukraine proxy war. And we saw that when he, worked with Lindsey Graham to guide through billions in a massive supplemental, what was it, like $80 billion to Ukraine, ensuring that the war would continue to this point.
He did. Mike Johnson came down to Mar-a-Lago and personally got Trump's blessing to finally let the vote happen. And Mitch McConnell thanked Trump for it because he was instrumental to ensuring its passage. And when he was president, he bombed Syria twice based on allegations of chemical weapons used by Syria, which have been shown to be not credible, to say the least. And he ramped up sanctions. In fact, there were more sanctions on Russia under Trump than I think under any other president. He sent weapons to Ukraine. He tore up the INF Treaty, which was actually a huge factor in Russia's invasion, because right before Russia invaded, it submitted a draft treaty to Biden to basically try to restore the INF Treaty, among other steps to reduce, the threats of war. And Biden scoffed and basically adopted Trump's policy of killing the INF Treaty, which was a really important treaty by a guy everyone's supposed to love. Everyone's supposed to love Ronald Reagan, at least in Washington. Everyone's supposed to worship Ronald Reagan. Well, Reagan negotiated the INF Treaty. Trump tore it up, and everybody just yawned because they were more consumed with Russiagate and fomenting conflict with Russia.
Yeah. And so I think it's such a historically pivotal moment right now. When we still don't know what the U.S. is going to do, but the next step here is direct war with Russia, which is why you and I have been issuing these warnings along with a few others who have an online presence or a platform in this country about the suicidal insanity of Russiagate and where that narrative was leading us to. It wasn't really ultimately about embarrassing Donald Trump with PP tapes. It was about, as John Mearsheimer said, paving the primrose path to take Ukraine to war.
Yep.
And that war itself was an existential war for Russia, in which if Russia felt challenged in an existential way, it would do some things that would give the Pentagon pause. And it looks like we had some briefings here between the Pentagon and Biden's people that may have at least halted the progress of this insane decision. We had a comment or a super chat about the possibility of Putin arming proxies, like the Houthis, for example, which is not a Russian proxy. Yeah, that's definitely in the cards.
He's warned.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't name specifics, but he said, you know, if the U.S. keeps doing this, we might have to take reciprocal measures and arm, you know, allies of ours that could hit U.S. facilities, like military facilities in the region. So he's talked about it.
Yeah, he said he mentioned it first at the St. Petersburg economic conference in a meeting with journalists that's something Russia could do. I mean, the U.S. is very exposed in places like Syria, where the Arab tribes are actually already taking on the U.S. Kurdish proxies and threatening U.S. military assets there with not a whole lot of firepower. But if they were given some heavy weapons, sophisticated anti-tank weapons, even like the cornets that Hezbollah has, they could do some serious damage. And of course, it's going to be U.S. service members who are going to pay the price for this neoconservative lunacy